Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. In this episode, I am talking to Ashley King. Ashley King is a licensed professional counselor and has a handful of master's degrees in education and counseling and psychology, respectively. She's a somatic therapist and works in a private practice just outside Philadelphia with an emphasis on yoga, meditation, somatic therapy, and along with many other topics within the existential humanistic framework. In this conversation, we talked about a whole bunch of things. I learned a lot, and it was really nice to get somebody on the podcast that has a clinical background. And so we got into a few topics. First, we talked about the overview of kind of the major therapies. We talked about her background and what she does and how she got into this world. And then we kind of launched into some of the overview of some of the major therapies. We spent a lot of time talking about the definition and explanation of the practice of circling. We talk about the amount of disclosure that can be healthy and or beneficial in a therapeutic relationship. We talk about the art and practice of circling in group and in individual work. We also talked about the philosophical and theoretical underpinnings of existential-humanistic therapy and treatment. We also talked about the essence of depth/insight-oriented therapy. We also talked about the aspects of manualized or directive treatments. And then we talked about the importance of conceptualization as important for therapy and not just only interventions alone. We also talked about some of the differences between therapy and kind of a life coach or motivational speaker. We talked about some of her work and aspects of somatic therapy at large. And then we talked about the limits and boundaries of personal ideology in therapy. And then a few other thoughts on self-help, thought leaders, motivational speakers, and many other topics. As I said earlier, I really enjoyed this because it was nice to, talk with somebody that has a clinical background. As many of you have heard at this point, I've had mostly researchers, social scientists, philosophers, and I've had only a few people with a clinical background, so it was very nice to get her perspective. Really, really holistic way of looking at things, but rooted in really nice theory and good practice. So she's a lovely person, very smart, very bright. And as I said, I learned a lot, and this conversation was great fun. So now I bring you Ashley King. I am here with Ashley King. Ashley, what's going on?
It's good to be here. Just excited to have this conversation. And I'm kind of psyched because you're actually in the clinical world. So
Yeah.
I don't always hear you talk about the clinical side of things. I'm just as excited to talk to you as I am to.
Oh, it's very nice. Yeah, I get that sometimes. People will say like, yeah, you talk about a lot of things. I don't hear all the clinical stuff. And so my kind of half joke to that is, well, I do it all day. So I want to do other things when I'm not, working and doing clinical stuff, but I am very passionate about that. So this will be a lot of fun. So yeah, thanks for coming on. So it's a big privilege for you to be on here. So tell people who you are and what your sort of background is, what your expertise or specialty or areas of focus are, and what you're doing currently and any future projects.
Great. So I am a licensed psychotherapist. I have a private practice in Philadelphia, although everything for the moment is online, virtual. But I work with individuals, couples, and groups, sometimes families. I'm also a coach, and I do quite a bit of teaching and facilitating in the area of relational practice. We might get into that a little bit. I teach a specific practice that is called circling, and it's a relational meditation practice. I'm also a somatic therapist, so I work a lot through the body and getting into people's material that's held in the body. And so I'd say that my passion is really about embodiment, and to not be, I guess, really straightforward and not esoteric about that, I would say, embodiment to me is really about living from the inside out. So I think this relational practice that I do is also a lot about embodiment and getting into connection with self and other in a way that is more bottom up than top down, which is sort of a radical shift in our culture. So I'm really passionate about all of that. I also do a bit of writing, although lately not so much for the public eye, some more personal essay and memoir type stuff. And depending on where we go today, maybe we'll get into talking about, I did start a piece, right? Or I guess it was in the spring. And then all the George Floyd stuff happened, and it just was not the right moment to say certain things. So I put that away for a little while, and I think it's still something that needs to be said, and maybe is also a little edgy. So I definitely am someone who, I don't necessarily try to create controversy, but I think I inevitably say things sometimes that are challenging to people's sensibilities. So.
Okay. No, that's great. That's great. Are you from the Philly area? Like that's where you've rooted, or?
I am from the Philly area, but the Jersey side of the river. So
okay.
20, 30 minutes.
Yeah, all right. Very cool. So okay, let's start with that. I think that's a nice segue into that. So tell me about, so you mentioned that, you do, clinical work, you do therapy, and is there a particular, I guess, tradition and or theoretical orientation that you're coming from, or kind of set the table with that, and then we'll get into some of the more specifics that you've doing most of the time.
Yeah. So it is an integrative approach, and I'll tell you the big ones that are in there. I have a longtime mentor who is very, she's got a lot of Jungian stuff in her background. She's also, and this was my schooling background, was very rooted in the existential-humanistic tradition. She also did her clinical psych thesis on Jim Bugenthal, who was sort of a big player in that world. And so certainly the existential-humanistic piece is a big underpinning. Like I say, also have quite a bit of sort of a Jungian influence in there. And then, I have a long time background in Buddhist meditation practice, so contemplative practice, and also I've been a yoga teacher. I've been a yoga practitioner for between, I guess it's probably 15, going on 20 years, somewhere in there. So I bring that piece in as well, just the body piece, the contemplative piece, and then I have a couple of postgraduate trainings that I've taken. One it's a comprehensive 2-year training in a somatic modality of psychotherapy called Hakomi, which is all about using psychodynamic mindfulness through the body. And then also I'm trained in something called AEDP, bit of a word salad there, accelerated experiential dynamic psychotherapy. And that is Diana Foch's work. I don't know if you're familiar with her. And I'd say there's an element of a somatic piece in that, although I don't know that I wouldn't put it in the same category of somatics as, say, like Hakomi or somatic experiencing. But it's very much about being in the relational space. It works a lot with attachment. I also work the differentiation element. I think those two things both need to be there. But yeah, so it's very experiential. It's very in the I thou, as we've talked about, sort of the relational channel. So those are the big pieces. I just want to see if I'm missing anything. I would say those are the big pieces, and then obviously it's all influenced a bit by some of this developmental practice work that I do and that I just spoke about in terms of the relational aspect of things.
So,
and psychodynamic is certainly, in there. I sort of alluded to it, but I didn't maybe say it fully.
Yeah. So let me, that's great. I mean, that's really great. The thing that sticks out to me about that is, I think many times in therapy and in clinical practice, there is a, kind of an emphasis on, it's more cerebral. It can be more cognitive. It can be more, for some areas, dry focused. And I think that there is a void of looking at kind of a holistic, sort of embodied approach. Now, many people do that now. I mean, but historically, it wasn't always that way. And so I think that that's a really nice lens to do clinical work. And so, yeah, I mean, just for listeners' point here, basically in therapy, there's four major theoretical orientations, and then clinical practice. So usually, in terms of therapy, it will be psychodynamics, starts with Freud. You have cognitive behavioral therapy. You have family systems therapy. And you also have existential-humanistic, which is a sort of subset out of psychodynamic, and does its own thing, which basically takes the work and thought of many existential and philosophers and phenomenologists and tries to use it in an applied way, because much of that is talking about being and existence and authenticity. And so they have different models of doing clinical practice that way. So it sounds like that's more of your root base. And then outside of that, finding all of these other particulars for using a more holistic, somatic, embodied kind of way of doing treatment. Does that sound about right?
That sounds relatively right. Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, that's great. So tell me about the, you threw a lot of things out there. So tell me about, I am curious about this. Yes, you said the circling piece. I am curious about that. Tell us what that is, and how you use it, and what is its efficacy, and all that. Just explain that. I'm curious about that.
Yeah. Well, it's actually a timely question, because I will just say that I am getting ready to teach an 8-week circling course.
Oh, nice.
Starting in January, so kind of psyched about that. And I've done this before, so this isn't new. But so circling is a relational meditation practice. If I was just going to sort of say it in the simplest terms, and I realized that still sounds like, well, what, right? Mm-hmm. I think the tricky part of it is that it is a really hard thing to explain. And what's interesting about it is I think that a lot of it, and I think this is meditation practice too, is it's very bottom up in terms of experience, right? You're in it, and you're having experiences, and you sort of you come to learn through that, rather than the name, for example, circling. It's sort of it's not linear, right? Mm-hmm. It's very hard to say, well, here's what it is. It's a practice of being in the here and now with people in group space. And what happens is that the group or the collective starts to, it has its own kind of intelligence, right? The kind of the group field or the group intelligence. And it's a lot about tapping into that. So rather than, say, bringing in some specific piece of content and saying, we're going to have a session around topic X, right? We're actually listening and tracking and paying attention to what's alive in the moment, right? And we're reading different cues, like how you're looking at me right now, what the impact of that is, what's happening in my body as a result, right? And so it builds from there. And so it's a lot about trying to get something about the world of the other, and also your own world as you are in relation to the other. So what else would I say? I would. Well, let me stop there. Let me see. Maybe you have questions.
Well, I guess you're posing it in terms of like a group setting, right? But I'm assuming, is it just in group, or is it also an individual? So let's use an example. If, let's say, I'm a client and I want to get treatment for, I feel generalized anxiety, or I feel some type of mild depression, or, something of that nature. And I say, okay. And I look for a therapist, and I find you, and this person looks lovely, and they look nice, and they have a lot of experience, and this is cool. They have a certain branch of doing this. Okay, let me do that. What would I expect if we were to do that? And again, just obviously you would individualize it and all of those things, but in a general sense, based on what you're saying, how would this work between your traditional 50-minute hour client with therapist? How would it kind of look like?
Right. Okay. So let me clarify. I'm not using circling per se as a practice when I'm in a session with one person, although I'm using principles of it. Right. So it is a group practice, to be clear. It's not to say it could be a 2-person practice, but typically, it's a group practice. So, there are certain, like I say, there are certain principles that we use or that we abide by in the practice of circling that absolutely inform how I am when I'm with clients, right? For example, we are in the business of staying curious and allowing curiosity to trump the impulse to judge. We are in the business of tracking, and I'm noticing my bodily experience. So sometimes, in somatics, we might call it sort of the somatic counter transference, right? I'm noticing and I'm tracking the client. I'm noticing how the person is looking away when I say this thing or that thing, how the breath is truncated, whatever I'm noticing, right? And in the moment, if I'm in therapy and also if I'm in a circle, I might name what I'm noticing that seems interesting in light of what's happening in the relational space. Because a lot of times, right, so much of what we do in our body language, et cetera, is unconscious. And so the thing about both how I practice as a somatic therapist, but also how I orient when I'm, in a circle, is that people are always swimming in the water that they're swimming in, and they don't necessarily notice it, right? Like a fish. And so other sets of eyes, whether that's other people in the group or whether that's me as a therapist, I can put attention on that for someone in a way that helps them with a certain kind of self-study.
So this sounds, maybe this might be too splitting hairs. This sounds very similar to what most, I think, traditional Freudian or psychodynamic therapists would do, right? So in practice, there's like the kind of antiquated blank slate kind of thing, but it sounds like there's many Freudian or psychodynamic therapists, and maybe other therapists too, but I know it's kind of common for people in that model. Yes, to be very present in the room. And because it's all about the therapeutic relationship, right? You will make certain observations, and sometimes we'll share those observations and then say, okay, I'm noticing you're sitting here, or that, when I say this, you shift here, or, there is a very present centered kind of thing, which can feel exposing or intrusive for clients at first. And then you kind of adjust and see the utility of it. But is it similar to that, or is it something different in terms of how that is?
I think, there's certainly some overlap. I would say, what might be different is the degree to which, and again, this may differ from a therapeutic setting to a circling setting. The place where it gets different is how much of myself am I bringing to this transparently. So a lot of times in therapy, it's very focused on me noticing you if you're my client, me noticing what you're doing. Yes, in relationship to me, but I'm not necessarily always in the business of sharing what's happening for me in relationship to you, right? If I'm in a therapeutic seat. And this is where, it can get interesting, because in circling, we're now putting the cap on that, right? Everybody's in the space and, we're all bringing what is transpiring. So, and there's something that in a process of facilitation, there's a number of different sort of schools of circling and different ways of facilitating. And I'm trained in one that practices something called surrendered leadership. So this idea of the facilitator also being surrendered to the space and to bringing their full selves as well. That's, I think, different potentially than certainly a more classically psychoanalytic therapeutic thing. Unless I know, this isn't something I know a ton about. I know it exists, but there's sort of this, maybe you know something more about this. I think there's this school of more contemporary analysis that's like relational psychoanalysis. And I don't know, in something like that, for example, how much the therapist is bringing, again, like I mentioned, like somatic countertransference, for example, how much are you letting a client kind of know in the moment what's happening there for you,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
So I think it gets...
Yes. So, so that's illuminates a lot of things, because it sounds like there's more of a, I guess if you want to loosely use this, if you want to talk about power dynamics, right? That with the circling method, especially in a group setting, it's more of, there's more equanimity, right? There's less about certain types of power differentials. And I don't mean that in a nefarious way, just in terms of like, therapist, expert, with participants or clients, that's a type of power dynamic. And so in this way, it sounds like it's more lateral, it's more or less equal, in which, is interesting, because I think, Irvin Yalom, who's like he's like the godfather of, group psychotherapy. He wrote the biblical, the Bible textbook on group therapy, which is like in its 8th edition at this point. He, I think, is sympathetic to some of that, right? Group effectiveness is one of the key. There's 4 major, he has a list of like 10 to 12 big precepts or tenets that are important for successful group therapy. And one of them is, I think the most important one is group cohesion, not group effectiveness, group cohesion. And if I recall, I could have this wrong. I'm a little rusty on this, but if I remember, he also had some version of that where the therapist or clinician has like type of dual role. So they're part of the group and they're also leading the group. So it's, it's kind of you're wearing 2 hats kind of at the same time. So it sounds like it sounds like this component that you're describing is just a more accelerated or a more fleshed out version kind of that. And it sounds like on a theoretical basis, that's maybe has some origins there. In terms of relational psychoanalytic or psychodynamic therapy, yes, that's certainly a debate within analysts and or people that are psychodynamically prone of, how much do you not share in terms of your personal life, but share of your personal experience in the moment in the room. And so again, kind of old school traditional drive Freudians would say absolutely not. The blank slate, just no effective expression, nothing. That's not really used so much anymore. And so more of the debate just kind of hovers around, how much do you allow your countertransference to come out and how in a healthy way. So basically what you're feeling about the client and based on what the client is feeling, because it is a therapeutic relationship. So there's a debate about that. So some people do it more and some people do it less. And, there's kind of some wiggle room with that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think, it's a really interesting, I find it to be an interesting debate. And it's something that the more I do work with these developmental practices like circling, the more, certainly as a client, because I think any therapist worth their salt has hopefully done therapy. As a client, it's been something that has bugged the hell out of me about therapists, this kind of hiding in the role thing, and so it would be sort of hypocritical, right, to be on therapists for that in a certain way and to not kind of take myself to task as a therapist in terms of reckoning with that question.
For sure.
Right? How much do I expose, again, not for my benefit, but for the benefit of what's happening in the space and for the client.
Yeah. And I think this really comes down to, in my view, temperament and style, right? Because there are certainly therapists where they're overindulging in their experience, right? And so sometimes there's a line, and this is going to be a different line for each client. I think if the kind of compass is, well, what is the benefit for this client without becoming too attached or too involved in a unhealthy way? I think it should always be used, if it's used in a way that kind of opens or expands something with the client. And so less and less about your benefit, more about what is it about the client that can be useful of understanding this experience, whether it's a modeling thing, whether it's a corrective experience because of certain positional aspects of this person in their life. There is a lot of powerful utility for it. And in fact, I'm forgetting which theorist, but it was one of the Freudians, I think after Freud, I don't remember who it was, that started saying, hey, wait a minute, like countertransference has utility. It is useful. And many people, I think, agree with that now, contemporary kind of psychoanalysis. So,
Right.
So tell me about so this sounds like it's, it sounds like there's a spirit of it in terms of kind of these, I don't say transferable principles, but sure. Where you could do that individually, but it sounds like in terms of a, I'll say technique, or in terms of a sort of way of doing work, it sounds like it's primarily in terms of group work. So how does that look in terms of how you would do it for a group?
How does what? I'm just want to make sure I understand.
Circling.
Okay. So, right. So again, I mean, there's really two different structures within circling for the purposes of this conversation. We'll talk about one structure is one where the focus, and again, if we're thinking about this as a relational meditation practice, where the focus is on one specific person, right? So in the same way that if you're meditating, you have something that you might call an anchor, like the breath or like a mantra, something that brings you back to the focus, right? So like if there's a group and we're circling you, Xavier, right? Our attention keeps coming back to you. Now, it's what's happening in me as a result of being with you, of putting my attention on you, of noticing you, of, the impact of what you share about your experience. But the focus tends to be in relationship to you. That's one way to structure it. And that's something we call a birthday circle. This is sort of simplified for this conversation. There's lots of nuances to these things. But then there's what we would call more of an organic circle, which is like again, if I'm going to use analogies to meditation, it would be more of like a choiceless awareness practice. So the awareness just goes wherever it goes, right? Like I might be drawn to this person on the other side of the circle, not because the structure says in this moment we have to focus on that person, but simply because it's open and that's where my awareness takes me. And I might share that I'm being impacted by that person in a particular way. And then that has a ripple effect, right? That has impact on that person, that has impact on other group members, right? And so the attention goes where it needs to go. We follow the attention, we follow the curiosity. So it's a practice of noticing how to pay attention to what's alive, and using the feedback of your own system to let you know what's alive. And to trust that. So again, it's much more of this bottom up. I'm listening to my body. I'm listening to my nervous system. I'm not up in my head with a bunch of concepts wanting to talk to you over there about topic X, right? And so what builds from this, obviously, is its own sort of, its own experience. It's really hard to know abstractly outside of it what that's going to look like or be.
So it sounds like the utility of it, and so, I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong. The utility is you're essentially curating a certain type of experience from certain concepts. So instead of talking about concepts, I don't want to say doing concepts, but I guess in some ways you're trying to be in the moment, present with yourself and with other people in a way that is active as opposed to just more thoughtful.
Yeah, well, okay. Maybe I'll clarify a few pieces of that. And I think maybe this is what you're getting at. So I would say that it's a process of being rather than doing. Like you are doing something, but it's more about what's happening and what's alive from an embodied sense of again, being in space with people and following the intelligence of that and articulating that. And so being more than doing, and also, I just lost my train of thought. There was another thing that you had said. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was saying more about, like, I guess the main question is like, what would be objectively, like, what would be the point of this, right? What would be the utility? What are we getting at here? Is kind
So,
of the general question.
yeah. Okay. So I think there's probably a number of answers to that question, but one that I like, and I know we've sort of joked around about this and talked about just different feelings about things. Like I say in circling, we're really all about being in that I thou channel, right? So it's really about having an experience of the other's essence, right, in that way of thinking. So sort of I thou, right, where I'm not relating to you as an objectified identity. I'm not relating to you as a concept or even a construct. I'm relating to something about your essence. And so it's really about essence meeting essence, ideally, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're getting underneath all of these ideas that we have about ourselves
Mm-hmm.
that run us so much of the time. And we're learning something about what it's like underneath all of that.
Yeah, no, that's particularly instructive. I'll say again, for the listeners, a little bit of some background on what Ashley's been alluding to. So how do I want to couch this? You correct me if I stumble here.
I have a feeling you're going to do just fine.
Okay, so I'll try not to be too tangential because it's important. Around the 20th century, in terms of, or early 20th century, there was a host of philosophers that were trying to think about important questions, certain ontological or metaphysical questions, who we are, what we are in life. And so you have a whole tradition of people that were trying to get at these questions. So you want to start with probably Kierkegaard is probably one of the big guys on the scene. He had a lot of contributions. You get to Nietzsche, you get to Heidegger. And then after Heidegger, there's a bunch of guys, many of the phenomenologists, so people like Merleau-Ponty. And then there's plenty of, then there's the postmodernists and deconstructionists like Derrida, Foucault. But in between, especially with Heidegger, he's just a giant in terms of thought, in terms of all this stuff. There was a few people that were trying to use applied concepts that Heidegger was promoting, because he would talk a lot about being, and he talked a lot about authentic versus inauthentic, and he talked about the other and the concept of care. There's a lot of ideas that he placed, and his whole life was dedicated to the idea of being, right? What it means to be. And when you span it all out, it becomes a metaphysical argument. It becomes a temporal argument. And actually, Heidegger saw philosophy or psychology as, applied philosophy, right? And he was very active in wanting to use his concepts in applied ways. And so he had certain guys like Mildred Boss and people, Binswanger. And one of these guys that was an offshoot of them was this guy called Martin Buber, who developed a concept called I Thou. Am I good so far?
You're great.
Oh. And so the I thou thing is getting at kind of exactly what Ashley said, which was the essence of somebody. And how do I explain this the best? So just before, or right around, just before, Heidegger's mentor and teacher was a guy called Edmund Husserl, who was they call him the grandfather of phenomenology, who first thought about, okay, how do we get out of this subject-object or objective-subjective, and how do we get at what's behind that? And phenomenology literally is to the things themselves, right? It's, how do you let experience be unveiled or uncovered? And so for Husserl, he wanted to understand, okay, well, before we get to essence, you have to understand fact and or existence. And so for many people, this is something that all of these guys agree with, is existence typically precedes essence. So you have to understand what it means to be. You have to understand your ontology before you can understand your essence. But both are trying to deal with experiential or phenomenological way of doing that. So you don't objectively try to explain it. You're not subjectively trying to say what you think or feel. It's more of what is, or what is occurring, or what could potentially occur. And so for Buber, his I thou concept is how is my essence, right, trying to interact with the other or another person's essence. And so he had the I thou piece of it, I, it's kind of yourself, and then the thou is the other person, is trying to understand how to best connect with somebody at their core essence and who they are and their being in a active participant way. Is that about right?
Yeah, I think that's very well said.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's two things that, I don't think they're tangential. They may take us into, or they may be segues eventually into some other things we want to talk about. But
yeah, go ahead.
I think that there are particular utilities, there's particular reasons why I think this practice is timely. One, there's a lot of focus, sometimes we might say, well, it could be argued over focus, perhaps at times, on identity, on the constructs. We can get very calcified around those notions of who we are. And so a practice that's all about getting underneath of that stuff into the territory of being, in essence, feels, to me, I'll speak for myself, it feels important to me. And it feels like that's the territory where we're going to meet each other in a more generative way. So, that's one piece. The other piece that I think circling really does well, and this is built into one of the principles of it, is that we stay connected no matter what. So it builds into its space this capacity to work with staying connected, even when we don't like what's happening, or even when something about how I am in this moment is rubbing up against some way that you are being in this moment, and there's friction, right? And I think in our culture, we're not terribly differentiated. So we mistake agreement, I like what's happening, I'm aligned with you, with, okay, that means connection. Whereas when something happens where it's like we're not aligned in some way, there's dissonance, I don't agree with you, or you're showing up in this space in a way that's grating for me, it's like, boom, let's sever connection. Right. And we have not really built a great tolerance, many of us, for being in space and staying connected, even through dissonance. So those are two reasons in the particular current climate and moment that have me saying this practice feels especially rich and important.
Yeah, that's great. No, that's fantastic. Yeah, I think that is... I agree 110% with what you just said. I have to say, so, for you and I and other folks that are in the field or that think about these issues, this can kind of make sense, right? It kind of, well, not at first, right? I had to read this stuff for years before it finally clicked, right? 'Cause it's just
Sure.
dense and tough, and but once you get it, you kind of get it. And so I think everything you're saying is right. And I think what a lot of many of the clinicians and theorists that had this are right. But I think the challenge becomes how to efficiently communicate that to everybody else. And that is really, really tough, because I'm trying to have the outsider view here. If someone's on the outside listening to this and they're like, oh boy, these people are just, they're just saying all this, weird shit about essence and this, and they're like, oh my God, please give me a break. Let me just stick to raw hard science or something. And that's what I know. And I get that. I feel that. And I don't think those things are in opposition, to be fair. There is utility to the subjective. There is utility to the objective, 100%. But it's incomplete, I would say. And you need to have a way of stimulating the essential, or the essence of each person's being. And that's we have moments where we do that. And so there has to be certain types of acceptance, curiosity, redemptive qualities with each person, because each person is very complicated and they have different things. And the ways that I've said this before is, I don't know my own being fully, and neither does anybody else. No one else knows that. That's the whole part of unlocking or uncovering that. And you do that by living a life that's authentic, and you're moving about in the world with much purpose, and then, freedom, and trying to find that value. And you don't know it until you have that experience in some ways. And so that's what makes it very difficult, where people will say, nope, I'm not going to let anybody in. That's way too vulnerable. Oh boy, you're asking me to do a lot. That's very uncomfortable. That's very, very intrusive in some ways, even if there's good intentions. And I can hear that. Like, I can hear those criticisms that people have, either in a clinical therapeutic sense or even in a personal sense. And so I think for some people it requires a lot of patience, but I think the part of what you're saying, you are completely right. I think the way to do that is, or how to communicate that is the big challenge.
Yeah. And when you say how to communicate that, because you just said a lot in there, so I just want to.
Sorry. Yeah.
No, it's great. I want to just make sure I'm doing it justice in responding here. The way to communicate that, when you say that, like to communicate some of these ideas that we're talking about to sort of the lay person, for example, like, to somebody who doesn't necessarily have the language and experience that we might have as, say, clinicians, or as people who have, studied and trafficked in this stuff. Yeah. 100%. I mean, I think that it's a challenge. It's a great challenge. And, I find that just a challenge in general, because I feel like I don't always find the most effective way to do that. Because I live so much in the world that I live in, right? That like, sometimes it's like, it makes such intuitive sense to me, but not always having awareness of the impact of that on other people in terms of how they're understanding it. Now, if you go back to the experientials of the practice we're talking about, those are the kinds of things that we start to get feedback about in group space. Like, I'm noticing this thing is happening, and I may not even be thinking about, how I'm showing up or articulating something that doesn't, that's elusive to somebody else. But I think it's sort of this both and. What I'm maybe trying to say here is that, like, you're articulating that we have to have certain experiences to kind of know something about who you are, right? As a starting point to kind of
of sorts. Yeah.
Of sorts. And I'm saying, yes, that's true. It's a sort of a yes. And in these practices that, granted, yes, are hard to always articulate in the most meaningful ways, we're also discovering something about who we are in those practices. Yes. So it's both and in that respect.
Yes.
Go ahead.
That's a better way of what I was trying to say. Yes. It's not that, I mean, you can make that argument that everything's an experience. Okay, cool. I'm not saying that, I have to do, shoot heroin up my arm to know what it feels like to be, do heroin. I can have certain ideas about it, but, or you have to do the most egregious things to say you have the experience. What I'm saying is how you're trying to discover things about yourself through different experiences. They will happen. You can't, I guess you could, but the point isn't to try and force an experience or force something to happen. The point is that you're opening yourself up to the potential mysteries of who you are, that are within you, and then to be open and exploratory about that. And so you're saying it way better than I did.
Oh, maybe. I don't know that I am, but I also hear another thing in there, or at least what you said a minute ago, please. I think, but let me check.
Please.
You're saying some people are going to be like, no, I'm not opening myself up to that. Like, this is ridiculous. What we might call resistance, right? A certain level of resistance to going into this territory, right? And yeah, of course, there are going to be those people. This is not going to draw everybody, nor should it necessarily. But I guess, let's take a sort of therapy analogy, right? Like I'm sure you have people who they're open to therapy at some level because they're coming in to see you, or maybe they're mandated. I don't know, but probably I don't know what population you work with, but
it's all voluntary.
all voluntary.
I've worked with people that are what you would call involuntary, but yeah, at the moment it's all voluntary.
So when you get to a place with a client, right, where it was like not going there, right? Like, well, I mean, let's just talk. Like, so, you know, how do you work with it?
Yeah, I think it depends on the person. I think it depends on the individual client. I think that, I've been doing clinical work for, oh boy, at least 15 years now. So, I have a little bit more, thinking outside the box, right? And trying to say, okay, how can I make at least an attempt or an effort to reach somebody? But many times this is a general answer. Again, it depends on the person, but sometimes it will be, look, it seems that you have certain things in your life that are really challenging, certain things that you're unhappy about or you're discontent with, and that's bothering you and that's troubling you. And why don't we have an honest conversation about that? It sounds like a lot of that you're dissatisfied with. It sounds like a lot of things you feel are just absolute shit. Okay. So how do we tackle that? What do you want to do? Because you might not want to start poking and prodding around, right? That experience of doing that isn't fun. Okay. But it seems like you're stuck or you're at your wit's end. And what you have been doing, you're recognizing is not tenable. So maybe we try something different. And it might feel foreign or different, but the whole goal and the aim is something that's more adaptive or healthy. And sometimes, I'll give some version of that if there's resistance. And it might be more tentative, like, okay, I guess, or something. And okay. And sometimes, people just aren't ready. They're not there yet. And that's okay too. That's fine. So I think it depends, but usually some version of that conversation, and then they kind of, okay. And then they loosen up and then we get into it. And then, I see them for 3 years. So,
Yeah.
So, it depends.
Right. So I think, one, again, that speaks a little bit to one of the differences, again, of, say, what we might do in a relational practice setting versus sort of a therapeutic setting. Like, you're finding a way to kind of potentially at least be willing to look a little bit, right? Get the person to potentially be able to look. And there's a little bit of, it's tricky. I don't want to say like problem solving or sort of fixing, but there's a little bit more of that flavor in kind of coming to it that way, right? Like we notice resistance. It's like, how are we going to potentially get this person to maybe think about going there, right? Whereas in the practice of circling, and I would say even in my own orientation as a therapist, especially somatically, I think there's a lot of utility in just sitting right with what is, which is to say with the barrier. So we're hitting a barrier. That person doesn't necessarily want to go any further in that moment. And to get really nuanced and precise about what's it like to be here at this place where there's so much with the like in the body, right? And so in circling, one of the things we never ever do is we don't fix. We do not problem solve.
Yes.
And again, I know in therapy it can be a little bit different because we're there to do a job in some way, right?
Yes.
And so it's this kind of, the question of the both and. There's this being and this exploration of being, and then there's also reason someone's come in. They want to make some sort of progress. So I'd say that's another sort of differentiating factor. We're not pushing for a certain kind of progress in the relational practice setting.
Yeah. And I don't typically do that either in terms of my style is I'm not prescriptive. I don't typically give homework and all that stuff. I usually, we'll set very loose goals. We talk about the frame, right? We'll have a frame, we'll have loose goals, and then we'll find it. And And some, so this will be nice to bleed into our, kind of a next point I had for today. So this will get a little bit more, I guess, not political, but I guess somewhat, I guess, within the field. How do you think about or handle or, have dissenting views or supporting views about certain manualized treatments, manualized therapies, as opposed to, or directive is the way we would call it, directive therapies, do this and this and this in 12 weeks and, whatever, very solution focused, as opposed to the non-directive, non-manualized style of doing things. What are your, I guess, thoughts or opinions on that?
Yeah, so I'm going to I'll just own that I have a fairly strong bias about this.
Okay, that's okay.
I really am not a fan of manualized therapy and manualized approaches, and there's probably lots. Go ahead.
So just to clarify this, you're not a fan of it for you personally and how you do your work, or you're not a fan of it in general?
Well, okay, let's, I'm not a fan of it personally, and I'm not, and I will give a personal, I will actually get personal for a second, but I also am not a fan of it in terms of how I do my work. I mean, and you might say that's personal in both senses, but I also, I'm sort of experientially, as the client, I never understood it. I always found it offensive to my complexity. And then, there's also, why in the world would I work that way if I'm someone who has experienced this as so reductive, right? So it does come out of personal experience in terms of, how I've what I've had in terms of my own experience in those settings, but also, I don't practice that way. To be fair, I'm not going to say there's no utility for it ever, depending on the population. And I'll come back to one of my professors in grad school. This is a longstanding bias. So I brought this bias out in one particular class. This is going back, 12, 13 years now. And she was totally on my page. I mean, she was a depth psychologist. And what she did, she sort of played devil's advocate, and she said, okay, Ashley, so, you would never do CBT, for example. But suppose you had a client who had no insight, had really no capacity for insight, but was having all kinds of symptomatology. You need something. Fair enough, right? Like, some people are not going to be, they're just not going to be candidates for the kind of work that I do. And they may still need treatment. So to your point, it's more of a subjective. I don't practice that way, and I just don't jive with it. But I also think that the field is moving more in the direction of manualized therapy and also just intervention-heavy therapy. Where we don't really, in some of these modalities, need to traffic very much in the relational matrix. At one point in time, the relationship really was the therapy at some level, or it certainly was a central component of what we were up to. And now it's like, if you can just give someone like a cognitive restructuring exercise, or even in some of the even in my world, you could give them a vagus nerve hack or something to do, right? Like, you don't really need to get that deep in the relational experience.
What's wrong with that? I mean, maybe people want their cookbook, 2-3 steps to whatever, and their problems are fixed. What's wrong with that?
Well, there's nothing, like I said, to go back to my point about the my professor. You have a smirk on your face.
Yeah, I'm teasing you. I'm playing devil's advocate.
I know you are. To go back to my earlier point, there's nothing wrong with it. For certain populations of people, it might be really necessary. It's never going to be how I work. And I think just, if we go into just the earlier part of this conversation in terms of my reverence for relationship and being and exploring the experientials of the here and now, it's not fit. and I think, I also have this passion about preserving a certain depth and complexity in our culture at large that I see as being kind of eroded, not just in the therapy, but I think, what we're seeing in the therapeutic world, this is a microcosm of the macrocosm. We are living in this world where it's almost like we have this Amazon Prime notion. Like, I want to feel a certain way. I should be able to order that state of being, and it should be able to arrive pronto. Right? We have no capacity to stay in discomfort, to reckon with things that we don't like. And it's creating this very superficial way of life. And I, again, like I say, I think our field is just a microcosm of the macrocosm. So I see a lot of.
Again, yeah, but I mean, people are going through a lot. I mean, there's a lot of suffering out there. You're telling people you don't want to give them answers? You just want them to be in touch with their being all the time? I mean, I don't have time for that.
Totally.
I mean, I need answers. I need solutions.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, one of my famous lines, right, I say this to clients and people in my practice all the time, is that the process is the solution. Mm-hmm. That, how we get where we're going determines what we get when we get there. And so it's both and, I'm not an either or person. Like, so, I do see the utility of what you're saying, even though you're sort of joking and playing devil's advocate with me.
Play devil's advocate, yeah.
But it's also true at a certain level, right? And that's the thing. Like, we do want solutions. I'm a human being. I want solutions too, right? Mm-hmm. But sometimes we also have to understand that, like, part of life is that there aren't always solutions. What are you going to do when you're diagnosed with something where there's not a cure, right? Like, how are you going to live in the space where you can't have it your way all the time? Right? We also have to account for these things too. So, it's this both and look, I'm not going to say that I'm not somebody who doesn't work practically. Sometimes you need to, right? But it's not the basis of, like, I don't have people come in and, here's 10 tasks that we're going to do, and you're going to report back to me next week. That's, it's this very practical, tactical kind of, gimmicky. Sometimes that's how it feels to me. It doesn't do justice to the greater complexity of the person. And like I say, just on a personal anecdote level, a lot of times, like, you'll see, especially for younger people, for like teenagers, they'll do a lot of like CBT, and they'll do these therapies that aren't necessarily so insight oriented, because I mean, I think it's insulting, but the attitude is like, well, these kids don't necessarily have insight. But I remember as a teenager, like, going to therapy, and this woman was very CBT oriented, and being like dumbfounded that they thought I was that non-complex. Like, I'm just like, is this really, like, how in the world is this getting at anything? And then funny you referenced Yalom earlier, because I guess when I was 17 or 18, my mom gave me a copy of Love's Executioner. And I devoured that book, and I thought,
it's a great book.
Oh my gosh, here we are. It's like I'm reading this book, and then somebody sent me to CBT. I thought, this is crazy, in terms of the differential as far as the depth approach versus this very manualized approach. So yeah, it's never resonated with me, even going back to the time that I was an adolescent.
Yeah. Let me see here. I have a lot of opinions on this.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear them. Please don't.
I have a lot of opinions on this. Okay.
Conversation.
I'm I'd probably say 95% sympathetic to what you're saying. I'm in that we're on the same side on this. Where should I start? Okay. I see the utility for manualized treatment is, there's a lot of utilities. I think one is, I think in terms of clinical practice, it's important to have certain types of therapies and treatments that have a rigorous approach that's rooted within efficacy and effectiveness for social sciences. I think we need stuff like that, right? We don't want it to just only be theoretical. We need that as we're moving in a modernized world. And so I think there's something helpful for that. As you said, not everybody's at that place. Not everybody's ready for that. Not everybody's ready for insight oriented, types of deep, therapeutic work. And sometimes they need the manualized stuff before they can get to the deeper stuff. And I've seen that, and that's fair. I do think for certain things like certain anxiety disorders, certain phobias, and certain types of social anxiety, and manualized treatments such as exposure or CBT are, the data is very good on that. And as psychodynamic and relational as I am, I wouldn't really use that too much if I was dealing with someone with a very strict anxiety, because I'm understanding of the data, and the data. It's not that that type of work doesn't work, but you can't. It is very difficult to work with someone with intense anxiety at a deep, insightful level if they just can't control their thoughts, or they can't control some of their actions. And so I think that can be very helpful. There are other alternatives as well. So all of that stuff, I can see some of that, right? This is my steel manning version of manualized treatments. So here's another dimension to this.
Okay, wait, can I pause you for one second? I just want to respond to what you said.
Please.
I don't have a disagreement with any of that. Okay. And I think you've just articulated some sort of additional pieces about why we might argue for these manualized treatments. And just as also a case in point, I think your point that sometimes if somebody has a really debilitating level of anxiety, for example, you can't get underneath of that because the system is so disrupted, and that's 100% true. And the analogy I sometimes use is like, if someone's hemorrhaging, you need to stop the bleeding, right? And so there you go, right? I guess in terms of what I like to work with in my practice, so that's not necessarily the stuff I like to work with. Sometimes, people have these flare-ups that happen. But just as a case in point, I have somebody I'm working with right now in a much more depth-oriented way, but there's a specific sleep condition that this person is working with, and is seeing someone who specifically works with this, but through a very CBT type approach. But, it's a both and, right?
That's right.
That's getting very under control, but that's not my area of expertise. And then, we're able to do this other kind of work.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And actually, the one thing that's so interesting to me is that I have realized that sleep is, at least in private practice and outpatient, is something that comes up all the time. And, that's not something that you're trained heavily on in grad school, I guess, if you go to a special kind of place or something. But, and I feel like that needs to be more incorporated, because I just see it all the time as a kind of co-occurring kind of issue with anxiety and depression. So it's just kind of a side note, but and I have done the same thing. If I feel like it needs very specific attention, I'll say, hey, here's somebody specifically for that. And there's different studies that show good efficacy for like sleep behavioral management and ways to try and ameliorate for that. And then, do the more insightful depth work. So I agree 100% with you. So here's the thing with manualized treatments kinds of things. So they have utility. Okay, so there's a few. I'm trying to organize my thoughts. So there's a few things here, and I'm trying to be fair. I'll just speak for me. And when I was in grad school, when I was in my doctorate program, I learned all three major orientations. So the theory, therapy, research, and then practice of psychodynamic, CBT, and family systems. All that means is that I just did a lot more than what most people do, having to learn all that. And I remember we learned the way that it was taught, and there's other schools that do this, and you had mentioned an integrative approach, so this will sound similar. How you conceptualize, so basically how you see people, or how you understand people, or how you understand human behavior is, right? How I understand you, how I understand the world, how I understand myself, how I understand, that's, you're conceptualizing someone in a certain way. And a theory gives you a framework of understanding yourself, others, in the world, right? It's not the be all end all. It's not the 11th commandment, the fifth gospel, but it's a framework for understanding the world. And it's the 4 or 5 major ones have all proven, for some issues more than others, or certain disorders more than others, that, one might have more efficacy than the other. But, for example, for depression, which is probably the most common disorder you see, psychodynamic, which has origins in Freud, and cognitive behavioral therapy with Aaron Beck and everybody outside of him, have similar efficacy levels. You could literally do either one with a client and you're going to get the same amount of efficacy. So they're good, right? They're backed by science. They have a good theory. And I learned that it's less about what intervention you're using or what particular treatment, and it's more about how you conceptualize the person. And that's the utility of seeing, a psychologist or, a clinical therapist, is what you're getting your money's worth is how are they conceptualizing you as a person. And then it's a certain helpful grid, or it's a bookshelf of sorts, or it's a scaffolding of how to understand the psyche and how to understand human behavior. I can use whatever interventions I want, right? Because if, let's say, I'm, psychodynamic, and I like, or I'm doing attachment theory, and I'm doing Ainsworth and Bowlby, and that's how I view people, or whatever. That doesn't mean I can't do a thought record with somebody. That doesn't mean I can't do some joining or whatever that family systems people do, or that doesn't mean I can't do some elements from DBT, or the interventions aren't. that's not the magic, right? That's not the essence of something. The interventions don't have any of that, right? They're a bridge to get you to somewhere else. And it could be for alleviation of symptoms, or it could be for something a little bit more. What is therapy is, and this is validated by plenty of meta-analysis studies of therapy across theories, is the therapeutic relationship. And that overwhelmingly is the bedrock of therapy.
Yep.
And that's across therapies. That's in CBT, that's in family systems, that's in psychodynamic, that's in ACT, that's in all the other, all the alphabet soup, right? And so for me, I think it's less about, those debates and fights are fun in some ways, but it's less about the manualized treatment piece. And it's more about how are you conceptualizing the person, and how you're conceptualizing and what grid you're putting their challenges in. And then you are open to using, different resources. And so here's my bigger problem with this. My problem is when someone doesn't have that. When somebody doesn't have a way of conceptualizing someone within a framework, as long as it's supported, I don't really care what it is. As long as they have that, okay, then yeah, use your interventions. But when it's just, I'm going to give you an intervention like I'm throwing, spaghetti at the wall and seeing if it sticks, I just don't feel that that's therapeutic or adaptive or healthy.
Of course it's not. I don't have any argument with what you're saying here. This is really why in like supervision or even peer supervision, at least all of what I've done there is really about like, let's have a conceptualization of the case. That's sort of the starting point, like what's going on here, right? Mm-hmm. If you don't have that, you don't have some level of orientation to guide. Mm-hmm. You're just like adrift in the wind.
Right. And that to me is, I think, what happens often is, there's certain techniques or certain things that are done, and there's no reasoning behind it, right? Or the reasoning is, some cookie cutter, thing that and that you don't really, you're not in it, you don't understand it. And that's always my biggest issue, with those types of things. And or there, this happens as well with certain types of therapies or techniques. So I'll take this time to pick on DBT.
DBT.
Yeah. So dialectic behavioral therapy is a therapy that started in the early 90s, probably. And by Marsha Linehan, who she's, fine in her own right. And, she developed a system that has, to her credit, it's widely studied. It has now very good support. It's very efficacious. It has good effectiveness now. So it's legitimate, right? This isn't someone that just came up with a theory and she's selling a bunch of snake oil. Like, it's legitimate. I mean, I'm not going to take it away from that, but my problem with it is that there's a lot of really interesting and I think really useful techniques that are used in DBT, right? So DBT was designed for folks that have borderline personality disorder, which personality disorders are, I think, less than 5% of the population. They're very rare. They don't happen that often to have a full, actual personality disorder. And in fact, for borderline specifically, after mid 40s, it actually becomes more balanced and moderate and it's less severe. So she tried to find a system in a way. And so she incorporated a lot of different things from other therapies. Okay. My problem with it is that it was designed for people with borderline personality disorder. There's 10 major personality disorders. And, you could apply that out to all personality disorders, which are more or less this, they have the similar basis for diagnosis and the criteria. They start to sort of become criteria in some ways with exceptions. And she was doing this with group work in inpatient hospitals. Much of the efficacy for DBT is in that setting, with that population, with that setup. And I can't tell you how many people in private practice or in outpatient settings are just using techniques from DBT, again, where this hasn't been studied in those certain environments. It hasn't been studied with different types of population, hasn't been studied with different diagnoses. And to me, that's harmful because it's a very specific thing. And again, what makes DBT, let's say, different from cognitive behavioral therapy or psychodynamic or relational or existential humanistic is this was designed and created for a particular group of folks, as opposed to the other ones, which were not. They were trying to understand the human psyche overall. And so, I've known colleagues. I'd be like, yeah, she has a very famous workbook that she kind of used in tandem with therapists and clients, which is fine. And it's like, yeah, I'm doing this with a client. This is, great. And it's just like, why? I mean, and I get that you might like it or it might be helpful, but if it hasn't been shown to be useful or even efficacious for that group or that population, that's not wise that's not prudent. And so I start to have, I'm just using that as an example.
Sure.
But I think when other people do this with ACT. They do this with, a whole host of different therapies. They tried to broaden it way too fast and then try to use it with people it hasn't been used on. And, look, maybe you're fine. Maybe there's no harm done. But if, push comes to shove and, it takes a wrong turn and you're having to defend yourself and you're like, hey, you're defending a treatment that hasn't been, studied on this particular group of this population, that's inadvertently potentially harmful. And I don't think, and it's not, the ethics aside, it's again, you're not using a framework or a structure to understand a person. You're just using a way to alleviate a problem. And solution-focused therapy has its utilities, but that's not prescriptive. That's reactionary. And I think that's problematic. So yeah, sorry, I said a lot. What are your what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, you've obviously sort of looked at the research around DBT and have studied something of this much more than
A little bit,
I
yeah.
have. I'm certainly not somebody who, I know DBT. I know the basic gist of DBT. I'm not somebody who uses DBT. Although, to be fair, from what I understand, there are some mindfulness based components to some of it, or at least
Yeah.
components to it that are kind of adjacent to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think what you're saying that's interesting to me, and that I didn't necessarily know. I certainly know DBT is used with borderline clients, but I don't know that I knew that it was developed specifically for that population. I know that it's applied to and for that population a lot, but so it sounds
I could be wrong on that, but I'm almost positive it was. I'm almost positive it was at the very least for personality disorders, and maybe the whole goal was that it would be expanded, and that's just where she started. So I don't know all of the details of the history, but that's my understanding of it. But I could be wrong.
Yeah, well, I'm actually not challenging you because I don't know. So this is the first time I'm hearing that declaratively. But what's interesting to me about it, if you're right, is that I think I hear you saying that all these other therapies that we've been sort of mentioning, talking about, were not developed with a specific disorder in mind, right? Mm-hmm. Like, which isn't to say that certain therapies don't tend to get used more with certain populations, depending on the diagnostics and what's going on. But it's different to take a disorder, so to speak, a personality disorder, as a starting point and build a theory or a therapy around it, mm-hmm. versus something that's more generalized, for just whoever might be part of the clinical population. I do think that's a really interesting difference. And I hear your critique coming up around that piece. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And to be clear, like, because I give critiques, again, DBT is very popular, and I'm not just contrarian and like, oh, I don't like things that are popular. My thing is I'm trying to critique and to analyze things that are going to want to be more widely used, as we should. I mean, we should do it with anything. And I mean, if I can say my orientation of, psychodynamic shouldn't probably be used with everybody at every single time, then yeah, you better goddamn believe I'm not going to just say some theory that was made, 30 years ago should be used automatically with everybody. Like, no way. Right. Just like I don't think CBT should be used with everybody. Right. People are very quick to want to just use it with other people. And that's my kind of my critique. But to be very clear, very, very clear for everybody listening, I am not against DBT. I am not against it. I think it is efficacious. It does work, and I think it's very good for a population. I know it does have other research for other groups now, which is great. And there's probably, I mean, look, I don't stay up on it like every 3 months I'm reading it, but so maybe there's stuff outside of that which is fine. But at the time, or when it was coming out, it was a big rush to like everyone to use it or everyone to do it, and that's that's what I have concern about. And to make sure that people still have some way of conceptualizing why they're doing this and not just handing out, techniques. I'll just say one thing about this, but before we can switch to other topics, is when clients come to me, you tell me what you think about this. When clients come to me and they say, okay, they'll come, I want CBT. Right. They'll tell me, they'll be very direct. I want this kind of therapy. And I'll say, okay, why? Because that's the best one. And I did a Google search and that's, whatever. Right. And okay. And I'll hear them out and I'll say, okay. And then I'll ask them about what their, presenting problem is and how they feel, stuck in certain ways or what their goals might be. I'll say, okay, well, let me tell you how I do things, and you tell me how that sounds. Okay. So then I'll tell them, and okay, yeah, that sounds great. And then sometimes I'll ask, well, why did you want CBT? Well, I just wanted tools. I wanted skills. I wanted techniques. And so sometimes I'll say, it depends on the client, it depends on my kind of initial rapport or something. But I'll say, look, if you want that stuff, there's a lot of self-help books out there. You can go to Amazon right now, buy a couple workbooks, buy some modern self-help stuff, and you can get a lot of really good things out of it. You don't necessarily need therapy for that. Um, you could do it in uh, uh, as an ancillary thing to therapy, but okay. And so then it's more of a conversation about what therapy is and what it isn't, at least how I see it or how I've been trained on it. And so, but I think sometimes people come from a place where it's like, what they're really asking is, I want to not, maybe not feel this way, but I want to not have the same pattern of behaviors. I don't want to keep doing the same types of things, or I want to really understand myself. And so, they'll take things, that, pop up or are popular or make sense. But I think what really getting down to it is what people are really looking for is how can they understand themselves and how can they have, behavioral change. And I think that's the real question that all therapists or clinicians should probably ask.
Yeah. So what's your question to me in terms of what do I think about just what you just said in general?
Yeah, like let me, no, I didn't really put in this question. When do you have clients or do you have people that you see that come to you and they'll say similar types of things where they'll come at you with a very like kind of prescriptive, like, I want this, or have they've already done their homework and looked you up and be like, no, I know what I'm getting. So how does it usually work?
Choice B. I was going to say, it's funny because I'm listening to you and I'm like, yeah, I'm not relating because I almost never have that happen.
Okay.
And I mean, one of the things, obviously, I think that part of this is different. I've noticed this is different in different areas of the country. Like I do, I really put myself out there as very somatically based. So a lot of times people come in and they're looking for someone who has an orientation to working through the body. Now, if I was in Boulder, Colorado, or the Bay Area, people who do what I do would be a dime a dozen. But in Philly,
right, that's fair.
Like,
that's fair.
There's like three of us. No,
very fair.
So
very fair.
A lot of times are coming with a very specific thing, and not, like they want, or the other thing, and you alluded to this when I think we did the intro, and you talked about me kind of working at the, I very much do. I sort of, I'm in the clinical world because I am a clinician and I'm licensed and all this, and I have the training. But I also very much, incorporate these elements that aren't necessarily of the clinical world. I have a background in contemplative practice and yoga and these things I was talking about. So a lot of times people come to me because they're wanting something that's not as traditionally clinical. And so oftentimes the folks who come in are like, I've done a lot of traditional talk therapy. I feel like it's just a lot of shooting the shit. It doesn't really kind of it's not getting me where I want to be. Right. And I'm oriented from this idea that the body is sort of a storehouse for the unconscious, right? We house our psychic material in the body. And so we're, a lot of times people come in very specifically wanting something they know, if not like, I want to work in this specific way. They know that they're looking for something that's beyond the sort of the typical clinical thing. And so they seek me out. And a lot of them are people who have had a lot of therapy before, and they've been sort of left cold.
Yeah, so, that's great, because I think that's what I tell students when I teach. I'll say, hey, listen, there's a lot of us out there. And I think if you're a good generalist, fine, that there's a place still for that. But I think also it's like carve a space out for you to stand out, not, just on principle, but so that way you can say, like, I'm offering this specifically. I had a colleague that I know that as soon as he finished, he just wanted to do substance abuse work, and he wanted to do it in a particular area, and he carved that, part out, and that's what he does. And oddly enough, that happens so often that people just kind of overlook it, but there isn't a lot of very specifically focused people that do that. And so waiting list is always full. And he, he went and did all the extra training and all the extra certifications after his doctorate. And but that, that makes sense. So that does make a lot of sense, and probably why you don't see it, because I know you do put yourself out there in very specific ways. So tell me, I was curious about this. I know you had mentioned before and everything. How do you see, for you, I know there's probably a lot of overlap in certain principles, but you said there's the clinical side of what you do, and then there's the coaching side. Is that right? I heard that.
Well, I wouldn't say necessarily. I mean, I do some coaching, and actually, technically, I'm a trained coach.
Okay.
So I'm not going to say that I don't bring some of that at times into the space, but I think this kind of harkens back to what you were saying a few minutes ago around. Not that coaching is more manualized, but it kind of is in a certain way. It's a little more technique oriented. So I'm not going to say those things don't come into it sometimes. But when I say the side of me that's not of the specifically clinical world, I mean, the coaching piece is a part of that. But I would say also the pieces of me that have background in contemplative practice, that, the part that brings that, the principles of sort of a meditative frame into the work, whatever I might bring from my background in yoga, and also some dance background. So the pieces of all of that also inform the somatic elements of what I do. Though technically, I am formally trained through a extensive program in a specific lineage of somatic therapy. So, that is clinical in a sense. Though not,
Yeah, I guess, I think my question is really, how do you make the difference or the distinction between therapy and then, coaching or other things? Because a lot of people will do that. They'll say, well, I'll have a life coach, or maybe I'll just have a therapist, or don't they do the same thing? I mean, how do you, just in broad brushstrokes, how do you generally see those two, the differences between the two?
Yeah. So in broad brushstrokes, I would say that coaching is more practical and tactical. It's more about like, here are these things that people want to be, that they want to do, they want to be accountable to, it's more about kind of setting up a game plan a bit, right? And therapy is more about getting at the underlying material. Like, for example, you might hire a coach, but you realize, okay, here's all these, here are all these practical, tactical measures that we're talking about working with. And all of a sudden, a block comes up that has you sort of unable to move through this thing that might be on a list of criteria of things you ought to be doing, right? So in therapy, we might look at what's behind that, right? What's actually occurring for you that has you unable to complete this thing, or, that creates a stumbling block around it. So, sometimes I've noticed this too. People will say, oh, I want to do coaching, right? And it's sort of this way, and I don't know if you ever have this, even I'll sometimes get this in therapy. People will be like, not as often anymore. It's sort of occurred more earlier in my practice, but like people would come in and be like, I don't really want to talk about my family stuff. Like, kind of like, screw all that, right? Like family boards and stuff. Like, I just want to get to these things, right? And then, you could be working with somebody in a coaching capacity, but eventually there's these interpersonal dynamics that come up again and again that kind of create a difficulty around a certain level of execution. So if I'm a therapist, I want to look at what the psychodynamics or what the pieces of that are that are creating something in the core material, right? That are in the core material that are creating a block. So that's a very quick and dirty answer, but, what do you...
No, I think that's good. I mean, that's a great way of explaining it. I think that's a really helpful distinction, because I think some people will see them as sometimes synonymous, or they don't know the difference, and I think they are different. And the way you highlighted it, I think was perfect. Okay. So there's one other thing on this kind of world, and then we can switch to something more, I guess, less connected in some ways. So you've mentioned a few times the somatic piece. So I know we talked about the circling thing. I know you've mentioned meditation and yoga. So tell me, I guess, specifically, and I think we probably laid a lot of the foundational stuff here. So what is it specifically? How do you see yourself somatically as a somatic therapist, and the training? and then, kind of what that looks like and how it's applied, and how does that work from just, I'm not one of those, right? Or there's plenty of people that aren't. So how does that kind of look or shape, and what's the importance and utility of it?
Right. Well, I think, one thing that you will be on my page about, I think, here is the psychodynamic piece of, we're interested in looking at core material. We're interested in looking at unconscious processes and what is running someone at that level that we can't always see. Right. Now, how we get to that, depending on who we are and our modality, that might differ for me versus for you. And maybe there's some overlap, but one way that I've found that's very efficient at getting to that stuff is by working through the body. Because like I just said a few minutes ago, the body is something of a storehouse for the unconscious. And, the body holds all of our psychic material. And, if you buy into this idea of, even, I don't know how much you know about Wilhelm Reich, right? Who's sort of the godfather of somatics, right? This idea of
very, very loosely.
Okay. Well, he had this idea, I won't go too deeply into it, but that we have what he would call, character structures, actually somatic, certain physical body characteristics in terms of that we're actually, how we hold ourselves, but also that are emblematic of certain issues, right? Like, so you have, they have very pathological names at that point in time. And a lot of these more modern somatic therapies, we've renamed them. But, in the Reichian character maps, you had like the psychopath and the schizoid. And, if you look this up, you can actually see physical pictures of these different body types. So part of what we do is we read somatic structure, right? Which again, they're loose maps. We're not like imposing these ideas upon people. But again, like we were talking about sort of having a theoretical map, right? We do start to see certain kinds of, we sort of see the physical manifestations of character strategy, of how people have protections and how people have physical and somatic protections. And we start to see patterns, right? And so what we do with that is we, again, a la what I was saying earlier about working much more in the living moment, which very much I do in the somatic work as well, is we start to explore these body experiences where we're holding tension, for example, where, something feels really open. We start to look at how all of that's manifesting and study that in real time in the space with an element of mindfulness. So there's, I often work a lot with people who have the capacity to have that sort of witness consciousness online. So they're not fused completely with their experience, which of course sometimes happens too, but they have some ability to step outside of that and notice what's happening in their body and be able to put attention on it in a particular way and track it. And what we sometimes do is we do little experiments, little body experiments in the present moment to start to learn something about our somatic material. And so we start to see, like, and that's as part of how I'm trained, I started to be able to track things like core beliefs, the core material, and you start to see how this actually plays out in the moment and in the physical and somatic experience, right? And then we can work with it, and we can work with trying out different behaviors, different experiences, and we can track what happens in that, right? So we're not just tracking for kind of where is there a barrier to receiving nourishment or something, but also as we play with these things, we can play with having, what would it be like to try this instead, and to actually notice the impacts of that somatically, right? So it's a lot about working in the moment through the body, my eyes being trained to see and notice and track certain things. And then, of course, having these maps, right? These somatic maps to help inform that, to help having to come back to your idea that we should always have some working concept of what's happening and going on for the client. We shouldn't just be throwing shit in the wind and seeing if it sticks, right? We have some sense of, where is this person in terms of what's happening here? What are we looking at? What are we working with? And what are we doing to that end? So that's a little piece. I probably said a lot.
No, I mean, that's particularly educational for me, and it sounds fantastic. Yeah, that was great. I can't help but hear lots of Merleau-Ponty's, phenomenology in that, where, just his whole thing was, trying to explain experience that people have beyond the objective subjective through the body and how you do that. And so I really, that idea that you're explaining that resonates with me with, there's things that live or stay in the body, different experiences that we have or different modes of being that we have, and trying to not, to use that, I guess you could say, or to explore that is, I think could be, terribly helpful for a lot of people. And I can't help but also think on the other side of it that, there's probably elements that, with health psychology, right, where there's lots of, the biopsychosocial model that uses these ideas as well, where we have to look at the integration of the body. That's a little bit more it tends to be more on a medical side of things, but still, I think that there's an importance to saying therapeutically, hey, how is your experiences or your essence, how does it live there? And how can we find, if it's strained of some ways, that how do we find alternatives for doing that? I guess the one question I have on that is that only work that you do present in session, or are there things that you do, or I don't want to say prescribe, but things that you suggest that they do outside of a session and then they bring and use it in the session? Or is it just momentary based, week to week kind of thing? How does that kind of work?
Right. So it might be the kind of thing where we're in session and we make a certain discovery about how someone is in their body in real time, like through something we're doing live, right? And so, of course, we do a little bit of integration work too. We have the experiential, and then I do a lot of framing. What just happened here? What are we looking at? What are we working with? Right? Yeah. Me kind of tying the pieces together. And then it might be the sort of thing where, hey, we just had this experience today where we noticed X, Y, or Z thing. And it would be really interesting if you were to track this out in the world for yourself this week, out, in life, right? So the therapy is sort of a microcosm. The idea is that we're going to take these ways of being that we're learning in this space out into the world. And so there might be a way that I would ask that person to notice how this is out in your life this week, or maybe even in very specific contexts, if it's something more that seems to be more context specific, and to really, again, bring that spirit of curiosity and just tracking, noticing to what's happening, right? And then sometimes, the person will come back and have something to report, or just, I just noticed this thing, or this was really fascinating, or, there'll be something. Sometimes it's like that they have trouble with something. So it's less like, here's something to go do and check off a list in a behavioral way. But I would say a lot of what I, quote unquote, I think to use your word, prescribe, has more to do with that kind of meditative aspect of noticing and tracking. Right. And then because we actually have to be aware of something, and we have to be as aware of it as we can be, right? Ideally, to start to work with it more meaningfully. Maybe also we did a little experiment in session where we tried out a different way of being, and it was successful, or it yielded something interesting. And then, again, translating that out into the world. What's that like in a larger context?
And is this where you would fit in maybe certain types of mindfulness or meditative practice in session, or I don't know if you would do necessarily certain yoga practices, but would you incorporate some of those other elements into session at that point when you're discussing these types of things to make it more tangible?
Yeah. So great question. One thing I would say is that when it comes to the mindfulness piece, I I incorporate that is happening throughout the therapy, like this process of putting attention on what's happening throughout the process, tracking, being in the present moment with that as much as possible, with that sort of witness consciousness there, so we can notice that, oh, this part is here and this part is here, right? And these things are happening. So it's mindfulness as a sort of a living function within the space, as opposed to an adjunctive thing. Like, I'm going to go have you now sit on the cushion for 5 minutes and notice your breath, right? It's not that. It's much more of like meditation in action.
Yeah, I think of it, my heuristic for this is, kind of, instead of a state, a trait kind of aspect of it, right? Is it a mode of being and learning how to have that, as opposed to this kind of active participant kind of way of doing things, is how I see it.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because I think over the years, my own personal practice of meditation has shifted a lot from, just the sitting on a cushion, right, and training in that way. Not that doesn't have its efficacy too, sure. But I'm much more interested in a sort of a living practice of it out in the world with people, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. Okay. So last thing, unless there's something specific that you wanted to hit here, but my last thing here is, I guess, thematically, is one of the things is how in current society, or in our modern age, how we have a few things here. How do we have, I guess there are two subsets. What is the role, or sorry, let me rephrase this. What are the limits and or boundaries of certain ideologies with clinicians? That would be one aspect of it. And then the second aspect of the question would be, how do we understand people that are more popularized, whether they are kind of these motivational people or self-help people that kind of take the elements of therapy or elements of clinical practice, or they have maybe roots in that and they just go full-blown self-help or motivational speaker and stuff. And how to, what are your thoughts on that? So I guess those are two different things, but yeah, I can ask you the second one again, but what do you think about, I guess, the first one of, the limits and boundaries of certain ideologies, personal or whatever, and how we use that in practice with client?
Yeah. So let me just make sure I'm clear on your question. So when you say personal ideologies, like, I want to be a little more specific. I mean, and maybe this is even a question like, okay, so we obviously have certain clinical orientations, right? We have certain lenses through which we see things, right? And that's legit. And then, there's ideology, right? I mean, I know we use that word a lot. I mean, there's like, we could come to something with like a religious ideology or a political ideology. Like, so what are you, when you ask about personal ideology, maybe say a little bit more about what you're meaning.
Let's just go with the political one. The religious one we could do too. I think that's an important one. But let's say, I come into your office and, I'm wearing a MAGA hat, and, you have this undying love for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And, you have very strong opinions and you're very active in that. And I come in and I have some issues, and, I'm wearing a MAGA hat and, whatever kind of shirt and all that stuff. How do you divorce your personal political ideology, or should you divorce your personal political ideologies from maybe certain clients you're supposed to help that would be on the complete opposite end of the spectrum? How much do you put that in terms of like an activism kind of piece, or leave it on the shelf before you do clinical work?
Yeah. It's a huge question in the field right now. And I would also love to hear from you on this. I'm more on the side of the line that says that, shelving that, right, is like, I wouldn't, for example, if I'm not a religious person, I'm a very spiritual person, but I'm not a religious person, the same way that I wouldn't bring, but if I were to say like, okay, I would say I was, and I was very evangelical Christian or something, I would not bring that into my therapeutic space and impose that on a client. And I see the politics the same way, right? Like that's not, that may be a part of who I am, that can be a part of who I am, but like, there's also something that we're doing here that is, that's not that, right? Like, and I think I've spoken a lot today about getting into the space of what's actually happening for someone in the living moment, and what is, I think this is true in a lot of meditative practice, and certainly the circling practice I do, and I think it's true in therapy too. We're getting, I mean, somebody's construct of who they are, like they're a Trump person, they have these politics. It's very kind of ego level identification. No disrespect to that. I want to say that's a part of, I mean, the ego is important to our developmental sense of self, right? We don't want to throw that out. Right. And I think that, again, who I am and what I'm doing as a practitioner is inclusive of that level of identity, but ultimately it's also about transcending. So it's about transcending and including. So meditative practice or any contemplative practice is about getting beyond the relative self, right? And so there is something to come back to essence and what's happening for someone, in the space, in the moment, what someone's core material is. Like, all of that is really underneath of, this identity that's projected out into the world with the MAGA hat and whatever else. And so my work is really about getting to that. And so I think some of the stuff, if we can put it on the shelf, right, we stand a chance of getting in there with someone in a very different kind of way. I think it comes back to my idea that, especially in this polarized moment in our culture where we're so fixated around, these ideas of, well, I'm in this camp and you're in this camp, and we can't seem to find a way to make contact. I don't think that therapy should be just another version of the polarization camps, right? That's certainly not how I want to hold it. I'm curious what you have to say.
I have a separate question on that, but let me just pose an example here. This will be a fun one. Let's say you have a client that comes in and, maybe there's this client's a woman and you're a woman as well. Maybe let's say she doesn't have any, maybe there's no, terrible sexual abuse or something, but maybe let's say she's been subject of some version or some form of sexual harassment, let's say at work or something. Some jokes, maybe some, questionable types of, kind of mannerisms or gestures, something like that. And she's really offset by this. It's really, really difficult, and she wants to know how to work through it. And you're a strong believer in the patriarchy and kind of fourth wave feminism and all this stuff, right? And you just really, that's the lens in which you see a lot of things. Should you bring that or use that in your therapy with this person? It would map on, it would totally fit, should you do that?
So in this case, it would be like your first example was potentially a misalignment of sort of ideology.
Correct.
In this case, we're talking about, when my ideology maps to what the person's bringing, is it then... Okay, yeah, it's a fascinating question because it's like, I would actually, I would say that personally, no, it's no either. Not to be overly simplistic here, but like, I think, in the context you just set, to do what you're saying, to just let the ideology sort of run because it fits, right, would potentially be to to just sort of collude with the person's worldview and to not potentially discover something about what's happening there that's more complex, that's more nuanced, that's more who knows what. And I'm not talking about the nuance of, not believing somebody when they say they were sexually harassed, but, more of a nuance around, something in their, in their experience in terms of the impact or what's happening in, their body or their psyche, right? Like, I think this is where a practice like, I was talking about earlier with circling, I think is so helpful, is that like we oftentimes mistake content where we decide we want to go on the ride of content. Like, okay, I'm aligned with this. Perfect. The content fits right in, we're just going to run with this. And it just tends to be a reinforcement of what is and what the experience already is and the content as such, as opposed to getting underneath of the level of the storyline and the content into, what else is here that we could open ourselves to that might be larger than what we already know. And a lot of times, these ideologies and what we know, we get very fixated around it because it's like, well, this is my stance. This is my thing, right? And we let that trump the impulse to be curious about something in a way that might let us discover what else is there. And if I'm a therapist and I collude with that, I'm not doing my job.
Mm-hmm. So you're positing that regardless of whether there is an alignment or misalignment with whichever particular ideology you may have or don't have, either way, you don't want to use that as a mechanism for some type of aid or help or treatment very directly. And in fact, you're approaching higher aims of or aspirational goals of objectivity, neutrality, monitoring or policing your own bias. So that way, again, those things can tend to close down clients instead of opening them up and understanding more about who they are.
Yeah, they can, for sure. Now, I also want to be clear that like we're all human beings, right? Who we're practicing therapy. We have our biases, we have our judgments, all of this stuff. Right. And, part of being it's not, I'm not saying that it's always easy to sort of completely get these things out of the way. I mean, we, they're in us and they run us to some degree, even in unconscious ways. I mean, we might know something about them, but then there are also a lot of things that are running us, that we don't necessarily even realize. But I think it is our responsibility to be as aware of our own stuff as we can be, which is kind of hearkening back to an earlier thread of this conversation. And regardless of what that stuff is, whether it's your religious stuff, your political stuff, your own family of origin stuff that, is now, getting activated in the countertransference or whatever, you bear a responsibility to be aware of that so that the therapy isn't about you. It's not about me when a client is sitting here, right? It's not about my politics. It's not about my religion. It's not about my core material. Again, I might have to be aware of how that plays in terms of what gets kicked up in me. But if I'm using, and again, I think it gets tricky because at some level, again, how much can you completely separate yourself from your own stuff?
Well, I think that's the way where it is an aspirational type of goal that you're trying to have. Is that's the thing you're shooting for and you're working very hard to do it. There's going to be times where maybe, a moment or a session where it slips out or, maybe too much. Okay. Yes, we're human. We have our, our ways of seeing things, but I think that if you're always, or not always, but if you're very mindful or thinking about how can I shoot for or try to obtain those types of principles, I think that can be, I think that's the right kind of heuristic in working with clients. The second part of that would be, so what do you do if you see other clinicians or therapists that are doing that? Are you supposed to be a snitch and, say, hey, cut that shit out or leave it alone? Or, what do you think is the responsibility for us in that way?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and it's a very complicated one. I mean, I have such just like a kind of immune response to therapists who are, and I know lots of them. In fact, I've said, I don't know if if this is your experience, but therapists as a group, and I'm being really generalizing for the moment, but they can be very narc-like. Like they're, when it comes to like ethics, like, oh, is that HIPAA compliant? Is this, are you up to speed on this? I know you're laughing, but nobody can see it. And I hate it, Xavier.
Yeah.
It's like, really, is this like the tattletale central, right? And like I have someone very specific in my mind as I'm having this conversation, because it's like, almost somebody who derives joy from like getting you on like where you're not
Right.
100% aligned. So this question of, is it your job to like sort of snitch and tell people how to be, like, I don't, that's just not how I roll in the world. And I don't want people doing that, reciprocally, like, because there's a lot of people who would say, you should be putting your activism and your politics and your this or that. Like, you should be imposing that on your clients. And if I'm sitting here saying, no, there's people who would say, that's wrong, and you bear an ethical responsibility to do it for these reasons. I would argue with that. But the point is, I don't think snitching on each other, no matter what our positions are, I just do not think that's the answer in the adult world. And I hope to God, that I would hope to be surrounded by more and more colleagues who see it that way.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I do agree with the kind of subculture a little bit. It does feel a little bit that way. I would say, I think if there's, again, I don't really, I think there's a personal thing and maybe kind of an ethical thing there, which is, the personal thing is like, hey, look, I'm not snooping around, going and, making judgments and then pulling you aside and being like, hey, listen, blah, 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 or just going and telling other people. I don't do that either. I do think if somebody, unless you directly observe something harmful, or, if a colleague or a clinician or a therapist or whatever comes and says, hey, I had this case, X, Y, and Z, and there's like two things in there that, put all the alarm bells off internally, then yeah, I think that's different. There's a different context, and you think, without shaming or condemning, be like, hey, listen, what happened here or whatever. And then say, how I'm seeing it just kind of from the outside, this could be a little problematic. Maybe that should be corrected. I think there's a way to do that in a certain context, one-on-one. But yeah, this whole like almost sort of, hyper vigilant, a little bit of like a gossipy kind of way of like this, and this, I don't think is very helpful. Again, unless you're absolutely witnessing direct harm or unintentionally there is, but so I think there's exceptions to it, but I would mostly agree with you on that.
100%, and I think, just for the purposes of your question, I was hearing it as like no one in this sort of these hypothetical examples was doing something egregiously harmful. And obviously, just to be clear, if and when that were to come down the pike, that's a different animal. But I think that there's just a lot of overindulgence, at least insofar as I'm seeing, and granted, it's anecdotal, but there's a lot of overindulgence in sort of snitching on this, that, or the other. That's
I see it. I see it too.
Someone's opinion, quote, problematic, which is not a word I'm a fan of.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I see that stuff too. And I usually stay out of it. I'm not really a fan of that stuff. I guess, and then, I guess the last thing, and we can kind of end it on this, is what about people that kind of popularize, mental health treatment or clinical work, and they go the self-help route or the motivational speaker route, and they're doing some of that stuff. How do you feel about that, just in general or more specifically?
Do you mean quote unquote thought leaders?
Yeah, I've heard that term. I'm not very fond of it.
I'm not either, as you, hence the laughter. Yeah, and it definitely seems like, well, I had to laugh, right? This thread about kind of that somebody had on Twitter recently about, what feels like therapy, but isn't therapy.
Oh my goodness. I will say there was some reading, though I didn't get involved in it, but reading it, there was some very amusing things. They're very funny.
For sure, right? But it's like this whole kind of, very granted watered down, but sort of watered down therapeutic culture is getting popularized in that whole sort of thought leader set, and gosh, where to start with it? I mean, so the question is sort of, what do I think about it?
Yeah.
I mean, let's start
what
with
what are your opinions on it? Do you like it? You don't like it? Indifferent?
I really don't like the term thought leader. I think that again, there's this way that a lot of, it's like therapy light, and it's sort of like, it's kind of this mass appeal, right? Again, I think it goes along with, I was talking about my own personal frustration with just the kind of dumbing down of the culture and like the watering down of things that are more complex, right? It's like I have an issue with the way that we're making, my word for it is like we're making a lot of this kind of thing cute, like,
Yeah.
And maybe another way of saying it is like we're making it kind of Instagrammable.
Yeah.
Everything is being distilled down to a meme. And the problem is it's so overly simplified. It doesn't allow for any nuance. And I think it's creating more of this polarization. It's like, okay, well, the meme, Brene Brown's meme or whoever's meme, right, said this thing. And then this is sort of all of a sudden this becomes applicable in all circumstances across the board, right? And it's like there's never any nuance. And it's usually, again, it's very well packaged. It's cute with like some good colors and it's, it's very cleaned up, and there's something about the kind of sanitizing of everything too that really rubs me the wrong way. And I think that, one of the things I guess we maybe touched on tangentially, but I think with regard to a lot of any of this, all the snitching, we're like trying to, root out anything that we see as quote impure, and so everything's cute, everything's sanitized, everything's picture perfect. And like true therapy, true depth work is really about getting to the essence of us, which is not all like, we could talk about being, but it's not all like sweetness and light. It's like instinctual and messy and politically incorrect in terms of some of our vital urges and all of this, right? So that whole culture of kind of Instagram thought leader, well manicured face to the world, again, it's an insult to the complexity and even some of the beautiful messiness of what it is to be a human being. How about that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think it's I don't try and have it as this kind of policing or safeguarding the field in some ways. I don't think of it that way. I just think it's one of those things where people in general are just super complicated. They're super messy. They're fallible. I mean, that's definitely myself. That's everybody I know. Like we're all that way. And to try and distill somebody right in a very sanitized version, and you have this and this and that's it, or this notion that I think what's maybe, I don't usually say this, but I think what's maybe implicit in all that is therapy is like not even a real thing, and it's super easy, and if I can just get the kind of Reader's Digest version on whatever thing, that's fine, and I don't have to do real therapy because it doesn't really exist anyways. I can read a couple articles, I can read a self-help book and fix myself. And the reality is that is what therapy does as a goal. Is it's you sorting yourself out, right? And the reason you have another person involved is for the objective way to find all the running threads to in a sense navigate some of that, but it's not the therapist doing the work for you. And so I think doing these very microwavable ways of doing that with these people that are, eh, they're making a buck. They're opportunists, and I'm not mad at it necessarily, but it's just not real. And I think the fact that people think it is, or that maybe they know it's not, but they still entertain it anyways, is problematic, and I think it does bother me. I will yeah, and so I don't like being too cantankerous, but
I noticed that about you.
I have, yeah, I can be. It's a very natural thing for me, but I try hard to be very balanced and see things, and I think it makes me hopefully a better person. But some of my instincts are that way. I will save my criticisms of Brene Brown for another time. I have many. I have many, and I have many because my research was on shame, and so I think she's abysmally wrong on it, and it pisses me off. So I'll save that long form for another time. But
okay, I respect that. And I just want to say, I'm so curious. I did not know actually that your research was on shame. So now I'm even more curious. I knew you had critique of her.
Yeah. Well, in general, but specifically on that, yeah, I definitely want to give it time, and I will soon, next couple of weeks soon, to give some of my critiques on that. I can steel man some of her stuff and say, look, hey, there's some, I don't like her thoughts on empathy either. There's some value that she has. I'm not, not everyone's all bad, obviously, but I think it could be worse, right? I mean, it's not like she's going around, she's trying to do, I think, positive things, but and making a shit ton of money doing it, and that's cool. Like, whatever, I'm fine with that. But I don't like the inaccuracy of it, and then going all the way with that inaccuracy, and then of course, if you say anything, she's super popular, and then it's obviously you're just kind of hating on her, and that's not my goal, and that's not how I feel. I just don't like how it's inaccurate. But I did promise you some of my thoughts on another person that is more popularized. So I'll tell you a quick backstory on this.
Right.
And tell you some of my criticisms. So I had this was last year, 2 years ago, maybe. I had a dinner party with a bunch of mutual friends, and this woman, Esther Perel, came up, and I kind of heard the name, and they were speaking very positively, some of my friends, about her. And so they, my friends know what I do, obviously, and so they asked me, like, have you heard of her? What do you think? Whatever. And I said, I've heard the name. I really haven't looked too much into her. And they, again, speaking highly, very positively. Or, okay, I'll check it out. And I will say this, like, I am one of those people. If somebody asks me to listen to something, to watch something, to read something, I will. And then I will come back and tell you my thoughts. So I don't say, yeah, check it out. And then I don't. I mean, again, barring unless I have like something huge going on in life or something. But so I checked her out. And yeah, I wasn't very fond of her. And so I wrote a few things down about why. And I had just some collections. And again, when I try so I didn't really know anything about her. So I wasn't trying to, like, come at it from a negative bent, but I was trying to just take the ideas. So I was trying to be as open as I could. And there was a few things. And so I'll tell you some of them, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree or whatever. But here are some of my thoughts. I wrote them down so I didn't forget. So I don't like this argument, but and I could be wrong on this, right? But everywhere I looked at it, okay, I'll say this. I'm not saying she doesn't have it. I think she probably does, but it was not easy to find, was her training and education. I had to look for that. I had to really look for it. I had to really find it. And I think that if you're trying to be authoritative, I think it's helpful to have some of that. like it should be easy to find of sorts, right? I'm not big on labels and degrees and this elitism. I don't like that stuff. I don't even, I mean, I don't have my, I don't have doctor or, my letters, in my profile, right? I just don't, it's for me. But I do think if you are trying to be authoritative and you're trying to do some of that work, I think it should be easy enough to find. And that was hard to find. I'm not saying she doesn't have it, but that was kind of like, okay, that's odd. I didn't see her published in any of the literature. So if you're coming out and saying you're an expert in your field and you're doing this and you're doing that, okay, fine. Maybe you're not a researcher. That's okay. That's fine. I mean, I don't do that full time either. But you have nothing published. Now, I could be wrong, but I looked at all of the databases, and I was like, nope, couldn't find her anywhere scientifically. So I was like, okay, so she's not doing that kind of work. I mean, again, she's doing something else, but she's not doing that. So, okay, fine. That's not the biggest criticism. But so here is the main one. This is ironic now that I'm saying this. I have typically a big problem with people going around and essentially giving free therapy to millions of people, and or right, because that's not therapy, and I think that that's potentially unethical and somewhat harmful. I don't think she sells it that way directly. I don't think she's saying that's what she's doing, but I have talked to other people since that will say, yeah, I just listen to her and I get a lot of good thoughts. I don't need to go to therapy. And a lot of people think that way. And I know a lot of people think that way. And that bothers me because that's not the work. And so there's a lot of pop psychology in there. And there's stuff that's like very watered down. Okay, fine. You can make an excuse for how like that's necessary to talk to common folk that don't know a lot of the lingo or some of the terminology. Okay, fine. But it kind of goes to what you're saying, if it becomes this very watered down version. And there's this piece of it where, so I've listened to many episodes of her podcast. I don't find it helpful for me personally. I don't really care for it. I could get why people would. I don't care if she signed all these agreements or whatever. It feels really voyeuristic to have actual couples on a podcast doing therapy. I don't appreciate that. Therapy isn't a lockbox. It's not some top secret. We don't let our secrets out kind of thing. But that feels voyeuristic to me, and it feels exposing in not such a good way. And then I have to, it's kind of like reality TV for therapy in some ways. It just doesn't feel right to me. And I don't really like that. I also think that, again, she's somewhat opportunistic, right? Like if people, they catch a wave and they go on it and they're selling books and successful podcasts and making money, that's fine. But if you think about what she's doing, she's using couples to showcase all of her stuff and making money off of it. And that kind of feels like you're making money off of people's problems at a mass level. And I don't think, again, she's doing that, but it kind of bothers me. And so I'll say this. I did see she has a background in psychoanalysis. She has a background in Minuchin. So, okay, there's some solid theoretical frameworks there, which is nice. That does make me happy. But I also think she has, a kind of bastardized version of empathy as, again, just this trope, this really cliche kind of way. Brene Brown does this nonsense too. And empathy, if you're taking a Kohut model, is really complex. Even if you're taking other types of empathy in the literature, right? You look at some of Paul Bloom's stuff, like empathy is complex. There was just a paper, I posted a tweet about it, one of the formidable researchers in emotion, about how we're trying to find a different taxonomy of how to categorize different types of emotions and how you need to look at the categorization as opposed to just blanket empathy. Now, again, I'm not well-versed. Maybe she does some version of that. Again, it just feels like the very, inspirational Instagram quote, and we just need empathy through connection. And that's how we just solve the world's problems. Again, I'm kind of reducing it that way, but it is very watered down. And I think in a confusing way potentially for people. And so I'll give two examples. I think you can look at stuff that the Gottmans have done and how they do couples work, right? John Gottman and I forget his wife's name at the moment. They've been doing research on marital couples for 40 plus years, actual science, getting them in their proverbial lab, doing types of trainings. And it's real work, real science, real data, and really good stuff. And they maintain some of their integrity in that way. And they don't go the route of the self-help and the motivational kinds of stuff. And I think it maintains a little bit of their integrity and a little bit of their kind of their chops scientifically and clinically. And I think people could get some stuff out of that. And I think that would be a little bit more robust and have a little bit more meat on it. Another example would be, I think I made a tweet about this too. One of the best emotion researchers on the planet is Lisa Feldman Barrett. I've been reading her, research since I was in grad school. And she just wrote a book, really small coffee table sized book, 7.5 lessons about the brain. And it's fantastic. But if you look at she has even for a book that's like 100 pages, really small, she had everything was referenced with current literature in the science, and then had links to websites for the full download of her bibliography or whatever. And it's just that's important. That's necessary. That's helpful. That's real stuff. When I read Brene Brown's book, I don't see any of that. There's some of it, but not as much. And with Perel, I don't see a lot of that either. And so that's something that is important. That's not all it is, but that's really important. And if I'm not getting some of that or enough of it, it does start to trend or border on woo-woo science to me. And that's fine if people want that. They don't have to get that. There are other alternatives. And I think it does more confusion than it does more clarification. And personally, I'm tired of always having to correct and dispel myths when I have clients that come to therapy about all of these things that are not maybe intentionally by these people, but there is impact and effect. And so I know I've hit her pretty hard. I don't dislike the woman, and I don't think everything she's doing is wrong, but I do have strong criticisms about her.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. And certainly I want to respond. And I'm actually not surprised. If you had asked me to guess what some of your criticisms might be, I would certainly say it's going to be something around the lack of empiricism, because she gets it, right? She gets that one. And I do, just personally, I want to say, just in terms of where I'm coming from, not that the rigor of science and all of the measurements and the data, so to speak, that's important. And it's not everything. And I am definitely someone who does not worship at the altar of the material world. I think that's its own brand of fundamentalism. That's a whole other conversation.
Sure. And I don't entirely disagree with that either. So.
Yeah. But what's interesting is, this was probably, I would say this was at least 10 years ago. So Mating in Captivity, Perel's first book, came out, I think 2006. And it was around 2010. It was after the book had come out, but definitely a couple of years. And this was back in the days when I think there are probably 10 Esther Perel videos on YouTube. You could count them on both hands. It's not the case today. And she was on this panel at, I believe it was a Psychoanalytic Institute in New York City. And the topic was something in the domain of monogamy and its discontents, or something around kind of mating in captivity, her book. And I don't know, there were about 8 people on this panel. And there was a guy, many of the people on the panel were these hardcore empiricists, and sort of taking her to task for some of these things that you're talking about. Where the clinical, where are you in the journals? What's the clinical literature? All of this. And there was a moment that was just beautiful, where she came in with kind of her fire and her precious Belgian accent. And she says something to the effect of, when I got interested in the perils of love and desire, because that's really the paradox she was talking about. A lot of her work, is about, just for context purposes for whoever's listening to this, is that, love and desire are paradoxical in some sense. Like, love would be to bridge the gap. Love wants to come close. Desire is wanting to move away and have mystery, right? And so how do we hold the paradox? So anyway, she said, when I got interested in the perils of this love and desire, I did not go, she doesn't make any excuse for it, I did not go to the clinical literature to do my research, because the clinical literature has no capacity to do what I'm doing here, which is try to hold a paradox. The clinical literature is interested in isolating the variable. It's interested in, getting to the value of X, right? It's not about, can I hold two disparate pieces together in the same place without collapsing one or the other? So she says, here's where I went to do my research. I went to art, I went to myth, I went to poetry, I went to literature, because these are the places, this is the domain that has the capacity to do what I'm doing, which is to hold a question of opposites. And how do we live with these two things together in the same place? And so because her work really is about paradox, I appreciate that. I think that's a well taken point. And of course, it's funny you bring up Gottman, because she got a little snarky about that too in that conversation.
Yeah,
and
she
she
did.
said, and by the way, Gottman has nothing to say about this. And he and Sue Johnson have definitely come down on her publicly. There's some factions going on in that world.
This is all the the nerdy kind of fights that we have in our field. It's funny. Every field has it, and it's always interesting how passionate people get about it.
Yeah. Yes. So I hear you about the lack of publications in clinical journals, for example. And I also hold that really a lot of what she's about isn't, she's not a researcher. And so I think that one of the questions that's alive for me in a more general sense, this isn't so specific to Perel, but I think this conversation maybe kind of brings it up, is like, what does it mean to have rigor? Is there a place for rigor that's not necessarily just rooted entirely in empiricism? Like, is anything that's not then thrust into the category of woo, right? And I have a lot of issues with that. It's very binary and dualistic, and again, I think also very watered down. So that's sort of what I will say for now on the piece about the empiricism and the journals and all of this. But again, I hear your point, and certainly not a new one in terms of, I think, a lot of what's been thrown at her in the field. The idea of, whether or not you can find her credentials, I'm not somebody who, that's never going to be the first thing I'm going to go look for when the thing that's going to attract me to someone is, does what they're saying make me come alive, and does it make sense to me? And,
Sure.
and she just has some real vitality and some, she's a thinker. I think of her almost as being as much a cultural critic. In some ways, I think that maybe that is more of the domain. Like, she has some really interesting thoughts about relationships and what's happening in the culture more largely. And she's been recently talking quite a bit on a couple of different podcasts and things about moving beyond a lot of this polarization stuff that we're seeing. And I think that has a lot of utility, and both in the micro of the work she does and relationship, and also implications in the macro. So that I respect. But with regard to the last piece that you said about, why am I losing it now? The podcast. I have to tell you, for somebody who is, I would say I'm definitely a fan of Esther Perel. People who know me well know I like her. I don't love her podcast either. And in fact, I don't really listen to it. I've listened to a couple of episodes, but I'm not terribly taken in by it for as much as I appreciate. I do appreciate quite a bit of what she does. The voyeuristic thing is interesting to me. I can certainly see why you would argue that.
When I listened to a couple episodes, I was white knuckling my chair. I was like, oh my goodness. I was like, this makes me so uncomfortable. yeah, how many marriage and family classes have I had where we had to do that and we had to, model this and we had to use examples, and like, yeah, I've done that in a particular setting of training and trying to do that. And there was examples and it was very protected and all that. Not on a podcast where I can just listen anywhere, where anyone can just listen in on that. And there's no, like, that just deeply troubles me.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think you've probably listened to more of her podcast than I have, if I had to guess. Again, because, it's funny, one of the criticisms that somebody, I can't remember now who, but somebody, it was a fellow clinician who listened to the podcast and also really didn't like it and said, I find her harsh as a therapist. And it's funny, I've done a bit of studying with her. I've taken a number of workshops and things, I took a course with her. And that's not untrue in terms of a bit of how I've experienced her and seen her in a room with people. Like, that can come through for sure. Not that I think we have to be putting on kid gloves all the time. I think that's a whole, other extreme that's now happening.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can see it. But then I guess just to play devil's advocate in terms of this piece around, isn't she just making money off of people's issues? Aren't we doing that just on a more micro level?
No. Yeah. I just use managed care to do it.
No, I know. I'm being sort of this.
No. I know. I think, right. But again, it is a little bit more, and like, I mean, there's always things that I've gotten used to it, but it does make me feel always a little odd how transactional therapy can be sometimes. But on her end, I mean, it's like, we're talking millions of dollars, we're talking a shit ton of money. Like, and, at the end of the day, is it just money, or, money's money? It's like, well, there is a difference between, 100,000 and, 4 million. I mean, there is a difference. And, again, I mean, that's not a huge thing for me. It's like, look, everyone's an opportunist at some point. That's fine. Like, what is she supposed to say? No, don't give me money for that. I mean, I understand, but it just does feel a little weird. I guess my thing, I hear everything you're saying. And like, again, I'm fine with her ideas. They're fine. I mean, some of them, she has some really interesting ideas. I just wish, I think the determination, so about the empiricism piece, like, yeah, sure. I mean, if you see my timeline, if you, a conversation we've had here and other conversation I've had, I spend so much of my time talking about phenomenology, which is way beyond empiricism. Like, the scientific method has limits. And it has a certain half-life to it, and it's not the be all end all. And I firmly believe in that, but I also do believe in it. And I think you need both. And I would rather her, if she wants to do what she's doing, that's totally fine. But she's doing something else, kind of like a cultural critic or some commentator, right up, she's a motivational speaker. Okay, fine. Hey, go nuts. My thing is this, and it's not some type of possession on my field or something. It's more of, that's just not clinical work to me. She might have a background in it. She might have a lot of really good transferable skills that she uses or whatever. That's fine. But playing around in that sandbox or still adjacent to kind of clinical work causes more confusion for, I think, people that don't know those differences. And I think that's, to be more responsible, I think would be able to do that. I mean, just as an example, the podcast I'm doing now, I mean, it's just nothing remotely close to anything clinical I do, right? Like, this is my night job, quote unquote, right? This isn't anything. I try to keep a very, like, I don't bring up, typically, I wouldn't bring up clinical work necessarily as examples, or I wouldn't do anything like that because it's very different. It's a different modality. This is something a little bit more. And I think it's important to keep certain distinctions to put forth as much as you can the ability to not cause confusion, that you're having some responsibility about how your message is received, and that people know very clearly what is going on. And so I guess in a generalized sense, that would probably be my biggest criticism. But right, I mean, like, her ideas about, like you're saying, the love desire thing, it's, it's kind of like, some version of philosophy of sorts, modern philosophy. Like, that's great. Like, I mean, she should go with her ideas. I guess my kind of concern is just kind of the confabulating it with some of the clinical stuff is probably my biggest pet peeve. So.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. And again, one of the things I was not hearing in your critique was I wasn't hearing really much of any critique of her ideas, right? Which is actually where I am a fan, right? I'm a fan of a lot of her.
I get that. Yeah, and I haven't done like a huge deep dive into those ideas, which is, that's on me, right? I haven't done that. And so it was a little difficult because I was kind of distracted by all the other things. And, I'd heard other people tell me like just glowing reviews, and I was like, okay. And like, but what I did read was good. I didn't think it was terrible. I thought it was good. I usually just personally, I like kind of more of the heady stuff, but I think the some of the ideas I did read though, I was like, yeah, this isn't bad. I kind of want it sold or couched a different way, but maybe that's just me being picky.
Well, maybe. I do think she has a really fascinating mind. I like the way she thinks. I think there is some really good stuff there. And somebody like, just since you mentioned her, Brene Brown, to me, Brene Brown is no great intellect. No, she's you're even arguing with her research, which I can't speak to because I'm not somebody who's done shame research, but, she's not somebody who I don't think of her as like a really dynamic, interesting thinker who's sort of proposing ideas that are ingenious, for example.
I don't want to say she doesn't have depth because that sounds like an insult. I don't mean it that way. So maybe a better way of saying it is, from what I've read 2 or 3 of her books. So I mean, it's not like I'm just, I read a review and I'm critiquing it. Like, I've read her stuff.
Right.
Carefully. It just seems like a repackaging. That's what it is. It's just a repackaging that's very it's like McDonald's. I don't know. It's just like super easy filler, not really nutritious, but it's fine. It'll make you full. I mean, that's kind of how it is for me, but
an empty calorie kind of way. But I think that, if you're going to go with the McDonald's analogy, or having a donut or something, but but I think that that's sort of the, if we're going to get, macro too, just the critique of a lot of this kind of self-helpy culture, it's that, right?
Yeah. Right.
And I don't like it either, right? I like more largely, kind of where we started this part of this piece of the conversation around just kind of the memes and the Instagramification. But, one of the things that if people want to take me to task on my not liking it, one of the things I sometimes get as the pushback, and I'll be curious what you think of this, is, well, actually, don't you think it has some utility, like this kind of Instagramification, just the McDonald's version, but just because it opens the door for people, it's not deep, it's not the real thing in terms of the depth work, but, it gives people sort of like, I don't know, it whets the palate or it opens the door to something. And I'm curious what you think about that. I have more to say about it, but.
Yeah, that's bullshit. I think that, that's bullshit. You know what it is? It's a very pretentious attitude, and it's a way of looking down on people and saying they're dumb. And I don't do that. Maybe some people are dumb. Fine. But I'm not going to sit there and say in a sleight of hand way, it just helps you get there. It's your gateway, it's your interest. And, not everybody wants the, really heady cerebral stuff. And it's like, well, let me find out. Let me try with the person instead of saying this is what they need to get there. I'm not saying that those people don't exist, but I'm not going to make those big generalizations about people. It's like, what I found? A lot of people are going to listen to 2.5, 3 hours of like some Yale lecture because they want information, and they don't want all that bullshit. They want something that has depth. They want something that has meat on it. They don't want just the 280 characters or, the soundbite or the 3-minute clickbait article. A lot of people don't want that, or they're tired of that. And so I think that that's, again, I think that's a little arrogant for people to say. I think that kind of looks down on people and says like, kind of dumb and they need to get that. So I'm not saying that isn't true. Some people do want that, and that's totally fine. I'm not making a judgment one way or the other, but my thing would be, well, let me just take it on what it is and see how people feel with it. And I think if you get a lot of response from people that like deep, long form types of things, overwhelmingly so, it sounds like maybe it's a little bit different than that. And so I don't think a lot of people do need that.
I love your response. It's really refreshing to me to hear that because, I get the pushback in the version of things that I just shared with you, because I have this sort of uncompromising aspect of myself. It's very much sort of like you're saying, even this podcast, right? It's long form. It's going to take a couple hours of your time. Like we're going to get into it. And I'm that way too. And I appreciate that stuff. And, even when I was, number of years ago redoing my website, just all this idea of needing to speak and copy speak to people and just, at least that's the way people are sort of trying to pose it to you. And I've always had like an instinctual, like, no, like people will show up if they're hungry for something that has more substance.
If they're hungry for it, and if what they're getting is deeply enriching, right? Like obviously no one wants to read 700 pages of a book if it's crap. They don't want to listen to 3 hours of something if it's crap. If it's something where people are in good faith and they're trying and they're having something of potential worth or value to say, or something substantive, people will be patient with it, right? Like, right. I mean, I've watched a YouTube video, in 4 parts, and I'll keep coming back to it because I want to finish it. Or I've done that with a podcast, or I've done that with a book, or I've done that with, a movie. Like, sometimes people, they'll just like, okay, some, friends of mine will say, hey, I'm going to check this out in the morning, when I got, 2-3 hours and it's, I can get to it, and they just do it all in one point, or they split it up. I mean, let people figure that out and stop trying to make shortcuts for everybody. If they want the shortcut, then okay, it's there. But, and I think it's just more respectful for people if you do it that way, instead of assuming that, people are dumb. It's kind of how I see it, but I don't know.
So. I'm amused at how you just sort of framed it that way, because it's not untrue, but I'm also just laughing because, you have said you are a pretty diplomatic guy, and your response to that was just like blatantly like, that's bullshit.
I am diplomatic, but I have my moments. I have my moments where, I will do that. And the only reason I am diplomatic is because, I've, tons of experience of myself, learned the hard way on many things. And I feel like being more diplomatic gets the most and best out of people. And that's really what my aim is. It's not about being right. It's not about having the supreme thought. I don't care about that. I care at most about people and getting their ideas and what they think and hearing that and that perspective. And so I find that the way to do that is a little bit more of a diplomatic approach. So that way it's not, too abrasive. And that doesn't mean that I'm harboring, all my really, controversial opinions. I think you can be diplomatic and be very honest. And that's what I work really hard to try and do. Okay. Well, that's most of the, I have most of the topics that we put down on here, and we've been going at a good rate here. So I is there anything you'd like to say, or anything add or ask, or any other topics, or?
Yeah, well, there's one more, but I don't necessarily know, just in terms of time, if we want to do this today. I think this is sort of a hot topic, but the whole topic of trauma.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Which, opens a huge can of worms. But I also just want to say that even if we just bookmark it and say, maybe at some point we'll do it again.
Let's bookmark that one, because I do want to give it a good time. But yeah, I think you and I have some convergence on, kind of the over application of that for many, many things that probably don't deserve that. And so, but I think that probably deserves its own time. That's such a big topic.
I think so too. And I just think it probably, just because any conversation about psychotherapy that doesn't at least mention it, right? Given how pervasive it is in the field right now in terms of like I say, a hot topic. We should just note that we know we did not get into trauma, which maybe will be a special episode.
Yeah. No, seriously. That'll be for the next time you get on here, and we can hit that for sure. I think that's a good topic to kind of to go in on that terrain. I think it's important. So yeah. Well, look, it's been super fun. I didn't really realize the time. That's how you know it's usually a good conversation. So you were very generous with your time and your mind and your passion. And it's I've had so much fun talking to you about all these things. Tell people where they can find you and read your stuff and interact with you and all that. Where's the best place to find you?
Yeah. So for right now, my website is psychoalchemy.com and my Twitter is @AK, like my name, Ashley King, @AK Psychoalchemy.
Okay.
And those are just probably the best places. I mean, I'm on Facebook, but that's sort of more, personal. And where else? Although sometimes if I'm doing something, like if I'm running a course or something, I will post that publicly on Facebook. Although that's on Twitter too.
Okay. I
have an Instagram. It's the same handle as Twitter. I don't like Instagram and I don't typically use it.
Okay.
But
well, I'll put the website and the Twitter handle in the notes, and everyone can find you there. Again, always open invitation. You were very instructive on a lot of things for me and hopefully for a lot of listeners. And so I greatly value that. And just a really nice conversation. So it was quite nice.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me. I will just say that you've popped my cherry, so to speak. I'm a podcast virgin until now.
Oh, okay. So, there you go. Glad I could be helpful.
Yeah. Sorry. Was that too racy to say?
No, it's fine. Say what you want.
I want to be polite, but I do have a slightly baughty and irreverent sense of humor at times.
It all fits. It's all on brand.
It's all on brand. Good. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. I definitely wanted to get your ideas. You have great ideas, and so I think that's helpful to promote and share. So.
Well, alrighty. Pleasure.
All right, Zach, likewise. Alrighty.
I'll talk to you soon.
Okay. All right, bye.